My name is Jay Little. I am a game designer by trade, but I'm also a professor at Stout in Menominee, Wisconsin, where I teach game design. For example, at the freshman level, it's all about tabletop design and gaming fundamentals, and then they learn more about video gaming as they go on with their education. But the foundation is really, really important. And part of that foundation is all wrapped up in the idea of making meaningful decisions during gameplay. I've designed a number of games, so I was saying before that I was really excited to see the ICV2 stats. I designed X-Wing miniatures and the Star Wars roleplay line, which are the two games that I'm best known for. But I've worked with a variety of different companies over the years and been part of the industry in one way or another since my junior year of college. So I'm really excited to be here. And then just one quirky fact about me that has kind of changed my perspective on what meaningful is all about. I've had 4 heart attacks and a stroke. I've spent 19 days in a coma, spent time paralyzed from the neck down, and I had a lot of time to think while that was all going on about game design, philosophy, and really what is meaningful. And it kind of changed my perspective when it came to games. Because when we commit to a game, we're committing to a very specific amount of time. A lot of us don't have a lot of time. So when we commit time to a game, we want it to be important and meaningful. So the idea of a game has a lot of different definitions. One of my favorites is Sid Meier, the designer of Civilization, who defines a game as a series of interesting choices, and I love that because it's got 3 power-packed words, series indicating that we have more than one, interesting, so that these are things that we want to select from, and then choice, which really drives everything about a game forward. Without choice, we're left with an activity. So when I'm talking to my students, I really push them to strive to create a game versus an activity. And the difference between those, in my opinion, is the presence of a meaningful decision. So by this definition, Candyland doesn't need you to be there to play. There is a linear strip. There are cards that are revealed. You move to that space. You are not making any choices. Your cat or dog is just as good at Candyland as you are. Right? So most of us want a slightly deeper, immersive feel when we're sitting down to play a game with other people. So then that begs the question, what makes a choice interesting? There are a number of factors that contribute to that, and it's impossible to define every single feature because there are so many different types of games and just as many types of gamers. So I'm going to take a look at 3 particular factors that I think really add meaning and interest to game decisions. And the first one is the level or magnitude of impact that that decision has on the current game state. The next one is the amount of drama that that decision creates at the table. And then finally, what are the consequences of that decision once you've made it? So let's take a look at meaningful impact then. So the first type of impact that a decision can have is a magnitude of effect. Are you throwing a pebble into the water or are you dropping a boulder in there? So people tend to agonize or second guess themselves as they try to predict exactly how large a ripple effect one of their decisions is going to make. In fact, that's kind of a sign of a good, interesting decision, is one that you're going to second guess, or one that after that game session you go, man, on that second turn I should have gone this instead of that way. Anything that becomes a narrative that you talk about after the session, that's a pretty good indicator that what you've done is created something that's interesting and meaningful. Another part about impact is its relative significance. And the importance here is the relative part. Whenever you make a decision, it just doesn't impact you, it impacts the rest of the table and the other players. So part of the calculation or determination when you are making a meaningful decision is thinking about this relative to your position when you're comparing it to the other players, relative to whoever your opponents or allies are in a game. But you can't think about it just looking straight down at your own board position. And then finally, another part of the impact is when you consider the total net gain or loss. Depending on the game or situation, the same net gain might be earned if you gain 10 points yourself versus a decision where everybody else loses 10 points. The net effect of a 10-point buffer now between you and your opponents seems similar, but depending on what the goal is for the game or depending on other conditions at that particular session, those can have wildly different effects on the outcome. When we're talking about drama, we're talking about things that aren't necessarily related to the mechanics specifically or the resources or the items within the game, but more about the people around the table and what sort of effect does it cause. For a lot of people, there's a certain level of narrative flair. And if you can think back to a game like Risk, where maybe you held off Australia against somebody else after they were rolling dice after dice after dice against your one army unit, a decision that creates a narrative flair, a decision that people are going to retell, talk about, discuss, maybe post on Facebook, that's a sign of a really interesting choice and a meaningful decision. Then there's also the metagame influence. There are multiple games going on at the table every time you sit down with other real people. There's the game of moving the tokens around or rolling the dice or moving on the board, but then there's also the interplay of people like, hey, be my ally this turn, let's backstab that person. Or, oh, you didn't pitch in for pizza, I guess you're gonna be the target tonight. Right? So there's always more going on, there's always more context to the game than just the game itself. You could have the exact same game set up with the exact same board position, but 3 different people. People that you know really, really well, people that you don't like very much, people that you've never met before, and that same situation is going to have a different effect on it because of the metagame influence. You've got a different level of influence or potential drama to unfold based on your relationship. And then finally, what I think is one of the most interesting dramatic impacts is the idea of a dilemma, where you have more options than you can choose from, where you have to choose one bad thing to happen to you in order to do some good thing, where there are 2 things that you have to accomplish on this turn, but you only get 1 action. So whenever you're faced with a decision where you have to sacrifice something, right, when there's some sort of cost involved, an opportunity cost, you're invited to go see a movie the same time you're invited to go out to dinner with somebody, you can't do both. That's a dilemma. Maybe not so fun in real life, but you put it into a game context and suddenly that becomes a really interesting point of play. Then we talk about the impact of the consequences. Right? If our actions don't have significant consequences, measurable consequences that we can see or feel in the game experience, then it's hard to consider those interesting or meaningful. And one of the types of consequences is being able to gauge what sort of blowback this decision is going to have. If I'm aggressive to somebody right out of the gate on my opening move, that's an interesting choice for me to make, but that could have long-term consequences, or I could get some blowback by now I've made an enemy right from the start. Then you're always balancing long-term versus short-term decisions. Now, in some games, this is much more apparent. For example, a game of investment or stock speculation or pickup and delivery, where you're actually expecting some return in the future based on your short-term investments. But having to balance those 2 things out, a short-term reward versus some long-term guesswork, some long-term speculation that you're hoping the game state will still be favorable to you when that happens, that becomes an interesting choice, and one of those choices that you will constantly second guess if you guessed wrong. Oh, maybe I should have made that trade. Maybe I should have sold iron when it was only for $10 a unit, or whatever it might be. And then finally, a consequence of leaving yourself exposed or vulnerable. Risk is a great example of this, where you can have this massive army and you can roll over country after country after country, but you're spreading yourself thinner and thinner and thinner. So it becomes a very interesting choice. There's this tipping point in a game like Risk where you decide, I could continue to be aggressive because I have an advantage right now, but if I continue to press my advantage, I may find myself vulnerable later, and is that worth it to me right now to be able to do that? I'm sure people probably have examples that they can think of games where somebody overextended themselves, or somebody made a commitment to trade fairly with someone and then backstab them later, right? All of these different things that can make you vulnerable, those become interesting choices. Those become things that sometimes you'll agonize over, wondering if you made the right decision all the way up till the end of the game. So if we've taken a look at some of the things that are meaningful, well, that's all great and good, but if it's a meaningful decision, then we have to figure out, how do people make the decisions when they're sitting there at the table during their game session? Now, there are a number of different things that we do just automatically or instinctively when we see a situation, and as you're more comfortable with the game, it becomes a little bit easier to assess how things are going. But in general, people tend to go through a number of different types of evaluations or decision making. The first one is an evaluation The second type is an estimation. The third type is a calculation. And then finally, my personal favorite, one that I drive into my students over and over and over until they're sick of it. That way they'll always remember it. Heuristics. And heuristics may be the most valuable and important tool in a designer's arsenal to be able to create interesting and meaningful decisions. So in terms of defining it in the context of a game designer, when I say evaluation, I'm talking about that instinctual, gut feeling reaction as you are taking a look between two or more options, and you're relying on either previous experience or doing that and trying to evaluate. You don't have perfect information. You don't have everything, so you are making a guesstimate, some sort of educated guess as to something's value or that blowback or that consequence or what sort of drama it might create. An estimation is more of an approximation of value. You might have a better idea, or in a stock game, you're trying to estimate between now how much it's going to be worth later. You've got some information, but maybe not all of it, whereas a calculation is the opposite. So each of one of these kind of looks at a stage of decision making where you have more or less information available to you. A calculation is a decision where anybody in that situation with that information would arrive at the same conclusion. Right? You have this much money, you want to spend it on that, you're going to have this at the end. Right? Anybody in that situation with that information gets the same thing. So that leaves heuristics as the oddball out. But it's really, really important to understand its role in games. Now, heuristics is a term that a number of people may have heard for a variety of either industries or business purposes. But when I'm talking about heuristics in game design, I'm specifically talking about this internal database, and this is how I describe it to my students. Whether you know it or not, whether you decide to or not, you have this database of knowledge that you are constantly adding more information to just by the virtue of playing games, right? And the more information in your database, the more you can draw on that information when you need to make a decision moving forward. There are two types of heuristics that apply to game design in this particular case. The first type of heuristics that people need to understand are positional heuristics. And it's important because they go in this order. First, you apply positional heuristics, and then you apply directional heuristics. People do this innately anyway, but the more aware they are of it, the better decisions that they can make in a game. As a game designer, it's important to understand that people go through this process so that when you're evaluating the decisions that you're making as a designer, you're impacting directly to the decisions players are going to be making as they play your game. So the first one, positional heuristics and directional heuristics. So the first one is important. It's the ability to look at the current game state and determine how well am I doing right now. And it's relative to the other players. So in a game like Monopoly, you're looking at your money, you're looking at your properties, you're looking at how well developed they are, you're probably looking at your position on the board. But if that's all you're looking at, you do not have a good understanding of how well you're doing in the game. You need to take that information and then compare it to everybody else's state. And that's one thing that we often forget to do. A lot of people will play and they have tunnel vision because either there's so much going on or they already have this plan in mind and they already know what they want to do on their turn, that they don't take time to just evaluate how well they're doing relative to everybody else. And this is important because we need this information to be able to apply the second part, which is now that I have this information, what do I do with it? How do I improve my position? How do I get closer to my goal? Whether that's a goal of earning victory points or whether that's just the goal of winning the game, but taking that information, that context that you now have based on how well you're doing and applying it. And that can be important, for example, in a game where you have to decide if you're going to attack the leader and try to bring them down so that you can vault over them into first place. Well, if you haven't done a good job with your positional heuristics on determining who the leader is, then you might end up making the wrong move, attacking the wrong person, or being a kingmaker and giving the victory away to somebody else when you thought, oh, wait, I completely misread that situation. Does the difference between these two types of heuristics make sense? So I'd challenge you that as you're playing games over the course of this weekend to think about it that way. Take a few moments during a play and kind of stop and think about, all right, what information is it that I'm filtering to determine whether I'm doing well right now or not? And based on that, what are some of my options and which one is going to advance my agenda? Is my agenda to broker a deal? Is my agenda to sell off some goods? Is my agenda to get to 50 victory points first? Whatever it may be. Another thing that I talk about a lot with my students is that games are a lot like economics. I love talking about economics. My wife has a master's in economics, and I talk her ear off, and she's like, I've had enough, right? But I really think that there are a lot of valuable lessons to be learned and applied from economics. If you think about it, games are actually little miniature economies in their own. Each game is its own micro economy. So if we look at it from that standpoint, then we can think of game decisions that players are making as a type of currency that they have. If there are 10 rounds to a game, then they have $10 to spend during that game on their decisions. Well, then people want to make sure that they're getting value for their money, right? Every decision that they're investing in the game, they want to make sure that they are getting a return on that investment of equal or greater value. Few things are more frustrating than investing a decision into something and then realizing that you actually got quite a bit less out of that than you expected. Like a pickup and delivery game where you thought that you were going to be reaping the whirlwind when you trade in some goods somewhere and then you realize, oh man, that was a complete miscalculation. There's an entire economy right there. We also see how the laws of supply and demand work, but more importantly, if we kind of view games as this little microcosm of an economy, that means we can apply other rules and models to gaming like we would with economic models. And this is where I think it becomes really, really interesting. So economist Dan O'Reilly, in his book, Predictably Irrational, fantastic book, by the way, about how people become completely irrational when they are faced with certain decisions, such as something being free, even if it has no value to you. But it's free, I need to have it, right? Well, he posits that in order for these economic laws to apply, there are two fundamental tenets that need to be true. So in order for these principles to apply, first, people need to act rationally. Makes sense. Second, people need to act in their own self-interest. Again, that makes sense. If I'm going to be spending money in an economy, if I'm going to be working with supply and demand, if I'm going to be investing and expecting a return, I should be wanting to improve myself and do better for myself. Unfortunately, there's a huge, huge flaw in that. This works great in theory, but terribly in practice. Largely because we are not rational creatures, but worse, gamers are terribly irrational. All right? I'm sure you can think back to examples of games where people did not act in a rational manner, and they certainly did not do something in their own self-interest. Have you ever played with a couple in love with each other who ends up giving the other person some favorable odds, or wow, that was a really, really good deal for them. Oh, honey, I won't attack you. That's because gamers love making decisions based on anything but logic or reason. Right? So if you are teaching a game for the first time, you will make decisions differently because your goal isn't necessarily to win. If you are trying to playtest a game, you're going to be the devil's advocate and you're going to try to break that thing. I'm going to be ultra, ultra, ultra aggressive. I'm going to attack every single turn. Maybe not something in your best interest if you were playing to win, but if the goal is to play to test, a little irrationality can go a long way. And I don't know if I've ever come across somebody who doesn't have an example of someone making a decision just because they can. Right? It's starting to get late. I'm not in the lead. I don't care who wins. I just want this game to be over. Or you know what? Bob's won all the games so far tonight, so for this last game, it doesn't matter who wins as long as it's not Bob. Not necessarily rational, but certainly within the wheelhouse of a lot of gamers. So it's great to understand all these economic principles, and as a designer, we often have a view of our game in a perfect world with how it should be played. But you have to understand that's not how gamers are going to play it. If there's a loophole, if there's a way to abuse it, if there's some edge case, players are going to find it. They're going to use that to their advantage. So I'm going to make a hard shift from here about being irrational to something that's a little bit more grounded. And that's, how do we measure value? How do we measure utility or the quality of a decision? Now, we're used to dealing with concrete measurements, right? A ruler is absolute and objective. If I give a book to somebody and a ruler to measure it with, no matter who I give the book to and who I give that ruler to, they're going to come out with the same measurements, right? Whether it's feet, inches, meters, whether we're talking about volume, time, we're used to these discrete units of measurement that we can all abide by. Value doesn't work that way, though. In economy, the unit of value is called a util. And while we're used to things being absolute and objective, utils don't work that way. Utils are completely relative to the situation, and they're subjective. So the value of a decision for the player in the lead may be different than that same decision for the player who's trailing. It's the same decision, same potential impact, same relative net gain or loss, but very, very different utility. So here's an example that we're used to taking a look at. We could look at a bottle of water, and we can measure it with some of those absolute, discrete units of measurement. One bottle is 12 fluid ounces. It's comprised of H2O. It weighs this particular amount. But how much utility does a bottle of water have? That really depends on how thirsty you are, right? If you are stuck in the desert and you are about to die from thirst, that bottle of water probably has very, very high utility. Now, if you work in a water bottling facility, if you can just walk over to, I refuse to call them water fountains, they're bubblers, all right? If you walk over to a bubbler to slake your thirst, right, that bottle of water may not have as much utility or value to you. Same bottle of water, but the value that it provides changes. Same with each decision that you present to a player during a game. Now, what's important to note, and one of the economic principles that I really find fascinating, is this idea that there is diminishing utility. That bottle of water provides a certain amount of value to somebody, but only to a point. Diminishing utility basically says that the more you have of a thing, the less value each additional thing has. Right? So even with money, there reaches a point where more money doesn't matter. If you're flat broke, getting $20, high level of utility. If you're Bill Gates and you find $20, does not have the same level of utility, right? The more you have of a thing, the less value each additional thing has. And in game design, that's a good thing. We want things to diminish over time, because if they diminish over time, that means people have to change their strategy. They have to make new decisions that now have more value. If that doesn't happen, then you can reach a point where people can spam a certain action over and over and over in a game. I sat down to play a game of Marco Polo Expedition by Reiner Knizia, and someone explains the rules to me, and I look at the board, and they tell me that you play cards to move forward by matching cards based on the space. But if you want to draw cards, you have to move back. If you're already on the start space, though, you can just use your turn to draw cards. And my immediate reaction is, I think I can break the game. Do you mind if I try? And they're like smug like I am, going, sure, if you think you can. So I passed and drew some cards. And then I passed and drew some cards. And then I passed and drew some cards until I literally had the entire deck in my hand. It never diminished in utility. And I saw that to win you needed cards, so why make small incremental steps and then have to take a step back when I can just stay put, and every card that they played eventually went into my hand, and finally, after an annoying 20 or 30 minutes, I just played out my deck and went from the starting space to the end space. And it really opened my eyes, because Reiner Knizia is a pretty established designer, and he's got a lot of great games. And I assume that that is not the expected play pattern that he had envisioned. But as a designer, you need to consider that players aren't going to act rationally. Some might argue that that was rational. I found an exploit and I wanted to use it, but I'm glad I asked permission first, right? So that the other players kind of knew what I was doing. Marco Polo Expedition never hit the table again, by the way. It's now sitting comfortably on a dusty shelf in my basement. But it really opened my eyes to that idea of diminishing utility, and I need to build that into decisions so that players can't just stay firm or feel too comfortable making the same decision over and over again. That either the situation or their return on investing that decision changes over time and encourages them to try something new, go in another direction, kind of test their limits. So to try to put this in more concrete terms for you then, let's see an example of utility and how it can degrade over time. I like Oreos. One Oreo has a certain number of utils of value to me, some level of satisfaction. One Oreo generally isn't enough though, so you have a few more Oreos. Around Oreo 5 or 6, maybe they're not starting to be quite as refreshing or tasty. Eventually, you will reach a point where Oreos give you negative value. Oreo number 100 probably is not going down so well, right? So this idea of diminishing utility is helpful. We don't want people to ever have a huge wedding cake stack of Oreos that they can just feast on for the entire game. We need to make them sick of that a little bit here and there to keep moving them forward. Now, another interesting part of economics is this subset called game theory, which is all about the math behind decision making. One of the weird math complications or puzzles that I really enjoy in gaming is this idea that sometimes a sure thing isn't a sure thing. That we trick ourselves into thinking the math leads us one direction, but in actuality it's something else. So there's a scenario when what we would normally be certain of, this 90% chance, isn't actually 90% at all. So there's a scenario, for example, that you're the goalie for a soccer team and you're facing a penalty kick. And you've got tons and tons of data that this person facing you has maybe made 1,000 penalty kicks in their career. And 90% of the time they shoot to the left. So as the goalie, which side of the net should you protect? Now, the instinct for most people is immediately, well, if they shoot to the left 90% of the time, we should guard the left. Initially, on the surface, that makes sense. Well, there's a game theorist, Ken Binmore, who argues that it's actually closer to a 50-50 proposition than a 90-10 proposition. That can be baffling to somebody. How can you take that math, all that data that you have, 1,000 samples, all that information, and now tell me that that information isn't reliable? Well, that's because we don't always observe all the context around that data. Yes, we've got 1,000 points of data to look at, but we're forgetting one important thing: the mind game, the human factor. It's not some robot or machine that's randomly generating a number to determine left or right. It's a person. And it's this fantastic concept called Yomi, which is both the Japanese term for the underworld, which I think is awesome, but also reading. It's the art of reading your opponent. That's why you see the same people consistently in a final table of a poker tournament. That's why in high-pressure situations, certain people can react or respond better. That's why a pitcher who just gave up a grand slam can go back out on the mound and clear the mechanism and get their mind straight. You got to read the opponent. You've got to consider the human factor that's involved when you're making the decision. So if we go back and apply this to the goalie scenario, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the movie The Princess Bride. Obviously, I cannot choose the glass in front of me. Because I know that you know, that I know that you know, that I know that you know, and we get into this spiral trying to outwit or outguess our opponents. That's an interesting decision, right? Because it's not just our own faculties and awareness and biases that we have to take into account. How well can we really read the other people at the table? Social identity games like Werewolf are a great example of this. One of my favorite by Jelly Bean games is Village Pillage, where you're trying to outwit your opponent and decide what they're going to play against you while you play certain cards against them. It's this fantastic part, and if you can introduce this kind of head-to-head part of a decision, that's a really interesting thing. Not only at that point of decision-making, but something to reconsider, tell a story about, or think, you know what, next time I'm not going to trust you. Next time you're not going to get inside my head. One of the other things that I'm a big believer in is the number 3. I love the number 3. I'm infatuated with the number 3. I talk about the number 3 again with my students, and I say that you're not going to remember everything from this class, but I hope you go away remembering 3 things. And by God, one of them is going to be the number 3. Because I'm going to drill it into you over and over and over again. And part of that is because we are conditioned in this society to understand the number 3. We see green, red, yellow stoplights. We see the small, medium, and large value meals. Small, medium, and large in everything, right? Clothing. Are you short, medium, or tall? Left, center, right. We have all of these 3s around us that we're used to. And 3 is this fantastic number to be able to work with. I encourage all of my students and other designers that when you're trying to decide how many of something to do, go with 3. How many cards should they draw on their turn? 3. How many actions should they have? 3. How much money should they start with? 3. If your immediate reaction is that's not nearly enough, then 3 worked, right? You already looked at that, you made an evaluation and decided, nope, that's not quite enough. But what's great about 3 is 3 allows you to go up or down a level. Do you want to be normal approach? Do you want to be aggressive or conservative? Right? How many different victory conditions? How many different ways do you have? 3 is also great because it provides options and choice without overwhelming the player. I know that I've played a number of games where there are like 10, 12 different ways to score points, and I'm just, I'll just focus on the first 2, right? I'm still trying to figure out this game, let alone all the victory conditions. Or you get a suite of, you've got 5 actions on your turn. Here are the 12 things you can do with those actions. That can be really intimidating and overwhelming. So maybe, especially when you're in that formative part of the design, you trim your tree down a little bit to 3. And then start to make decisions on whether that's good enough or not enough. Whether you need to go a little bit higher or lower. But I've saved a ton of time just starting with 3, then spending hours and hours deciding, well, how many cards should we start out with? Well, we could start out with 6 cards, but that sounds like a lot. Maybe 7 cards instead. And we'll actually spend this entire time discussing something that we haven't even seen at the table yet, that we're just thinking about in our head, when we could just decide, hey, let's go with 3, and get to the table and play test it and see how it actually works. 3 is a fantastic number. I can't stress enough how much time it can save you and how much easier a burden it can be on the player. I've got some choices, but I'm not feeling overwhelmed. That way they can read into those choices. They can apply heuristics more easily. If you have to evaluate 10, 12, 13 factors to try to figure out how well you're doing, how are you going to possibly make strategic decisions on how you're going to win? But if you can kind of trim that tree down a little bit, make it easier for them to evaluate by having less information, that can be incredibly helpful. I've got a couple of final thoughts with this. And one thing is to think about decisions per session. Over the course of your game, how many meaningful decisions are players actually making? The longer the game, the more meaningful decisions a person wants to have. If you're playing a short, quick, backstabbing game that's really reliant on luck and you only make a couple meaningful decisions, that might be fine in a 5-minute game. But if that's a 10, 20, 30, 45-minute game, it becomes less tolerable to people. But think about decisions per session, because another reason for that is that gives a player a sense of how much agency did I have? How much control did I have over the outcome of the game? I'm not saying that there's a magic number, but I would start with 3 and see if you feel like that's enough. Probably not, but it depends on the length of your game. How active do you want these players to be? How engaged? How much control over their fate are you giving them? So make sure you are offering enough decisions per session that they feel that the choices, no matter how interesting they might be, are also meaningful. That they're either creating that drama or creating consequences or having some other level of impact on the game state. The other thing is to keep in mind the idea of those heuristics. A bad sign of a game session for me, especially as a playtester, is if I ask them, all right, if you were to play this again, what would you do differently? And if their response is, "Oh, I don't know," oh, okay. What did you learn from this game that you could apply to the next one? I'm not sure. Oh, that's a really tough position to be in as a designer. What would be great though is if you're putting the information in there that they can think about and apply, and they can imagine either revisiting decisions that they made in the game that they just finished. Man, maybe I should have turned left instead of right. I should have attacked Bob instead of Ann. Those are really interesting. And then it can inform the decisions that they make the next time they sit down to play. The other thing though is all of those experiences, again, are feeding into your database of information, those heuristics that you have. So if you're going to have this database and players are going to rely on that to call on information that they can apply, then you have to make sure that you're giving them the information that they need, that it's easy to assess, that it's easy for them to understand where they are relative to the other people, what their standing is. If you think about it, this database gets filled all the time, even passively. I don't play a lot of chess, but if I wanted to, I could read about chess and learn about chess and put data in my database related to chess so that next time I sit down to play chess, I'm a little better positioned for it. If you play a game like Magic the Gathering that has certain mechanics in it, then you are better suited to play another collectible card game because you've got data in your database that you can call on and refer to. So it kind of brings that learning curve down a little bit. So make sure that you're giving them that information, that they can look at that and easily assess it in their decision making. So I ran through quite a bit of that there because I wanted to leave time at the end here because I know a lot of people often have questions about decisions in their game or other suggestions that might have. So please, I would love to answer any questions that people might have at this point.
Make sure you repeat it.
Absolutely will. Yes, in the back.
So I'm extremely interested by this last thing. Is it bad, in your opinion, to disguise a player's current performance level? Or like to make part of the decision making of the game perceiving your status and then making decisions from there?
So the question is, how do I feel about having, I guess, some hidden information about somebody's status? A game like Tigris and Euphrates, for example, you score and then you hide the tiles that you've scored, or having something secret from the others. Well, if the rest of the context of the game allows people to track that, or if guessing is part of the game, that's fine. But it's also hard then to rely on a group playing the way you intend, because that is a very specific skill set. For example, for me, out of sight, out of mind. My memory is terrible. If somebody scores something and then puts it behind a screen, I immediately forget exactly what they had. So I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, I'm just saying that you have to be careful with it. And if they don't have that information, then what information are you providing to them so that they can make choices and they're not just throwing darts at a dartboard, right? Few things feel more helpless as a player than feeling like you have no idea what to do on your turn and you're making one of those irrational decisions just based on a whim, boredom, or whimsy because you have no idea what else to do. So I personally don't like hidden information, or at least completely hidden information, but some of it, such as secret identities in a social game, can add quite a bit of tension and interest to it. So there is no right or wrong answer, there are more preferences, but if you are keeping some information from them, then you've got to consider what information am I giving them that they can make sound, logical, strategic decisions based on. Yes?
So in giving people different choices and trying to get your position in the game, how do you feel about designers and how important is it for them to potentially add a catch-up mechanic?
So the question was, how do I feel about a catch-up mechanic as part of a way for people to either evaluate or get back into a winning position? I think catch-up mechanics are great. If people can feel engaged longer over the course of a game, I personally don't enjoy games where there can be early player elimination. I don't mind player elimination if they can still feel like up to a certain point as you accelerate toward an end that they had a chance. But I do think that coming up with a good catch-up mechanic is great, such as an event card where the person in last place makes the decision on who's targeted, or some other way that allows someone in a lower position to make a decision that would influence other people. You know, which resource do we get this turn? Oh, I'm going to decide that everybody gets iron, because that's what I need. I don't care if you need it. right? There are subtle things that you can do in your game and a lot of mechanics that you can influence to allow people who are in a lower position a little leg up on the competition. Yeah.
You talked about diminishing returns and players can spam actions. Are there ways to sort of help prevent spamming other than just writing really in-depth rule books like you cannot do this, you cannot do that?
So the question is about diminishing returns and being able to spam an action during a game, and how do you prevent that? Part of it is by considering exactly what the game is intended to do in that endpoint and kind of working back from that. But in the example that I gave, it could be that you don't get to draw cards if you're at home base. Or instead of being able to draw 2 cards per turn, you draw 1. Or if you get multiple actions, I played a game about trading silk in India, and you had 2 actions per turn, and you could pass to get 2 coins with each action. So my first action, I get 2 coins, on my second action, 2 coins. Maybe for the second action, it would only be 1 coin. But some way of being able to impose either a restriction. Sometimes, though, you do need explicit rules. Some actions are just better than others. And I've certainly seen a number of games where on your turn, you can perform any of these actions in any order, but you can only perform action A once. And I think that's perfectly fine. Sometimes, though, you only find out the hard way that there is an action in your game that can be spammed, and they just hit the button over and over and over again to get the reward. Well, that's what playtesting is a part of too. And in these cases, I might not have the solution because I designed it obviously thinking it wasn't going to be abused like that. That is a great opportunity to engage with the playtester and ask for their feedback. What did you see about the game that I, as the designer, completely missed that made you decide that doing this was just going to completely let you run away with the game, right? Because sometimes the best people for that are the people who weren't directly involved in making the game. I designed the game with that mistake or that flaw in it. I need some other perspective to come in and offer me some insight into maybe how to correct it, right? Yes?
I'm a big fan of Dan Ariely, particularly Irrational. Are there any biases that we humans have, from that book, that we could put into game designs? Any that stick out to you?
So one of them is the bias of free. Whenever we see free, we go crazy, right? So if you do not add enough of a cost to an action, then people will, in my opinion, steer or put too much weight on that particular action because they're like, oh my gosh, it's a bargain. I need the bargain. Even if it isn't necessarily the best value in return, we perceive these things, right? It's like sometimes going into the store and getting free samples. You're not hungry at the moment. You don't necessarily need that. I certainly don't need the calories for it, but it's free. It's right there. Why wouldn't I do that? Sometimes those options and opportunities show up in games too. And we fall for that kind of red herring where we go with whatever the short, quick, easy answer is without fully considering all of our options. We kind of jump at that first opportunity. And I think in that regard, that could be a result of poor positional heuristics. You're not giving people enough information, or they overreact to one piece of information and prioritize it so heavily over the others that they don't look at or consider the rest of the board state. Yes?
So I know that there is a fair amount of personal preference that goes into people, particularly when it comes to how many choices and decisions they have.
Right.
What factors do you use when figuring out how to kind of match those together? Maybe the game would work better with more decisions, but some people
Right.
might just not like that.
So how do I go about deciding that decisions per session, or how many decisions is satisfying? And you're absolutely right that a lot of it is personal taste and preference. But what I think about, and when I ask playtesters, is I ask if this game overstayed its welcome. Is this like a house guest that you want to have leave, right? So there is no magic formula for 3 decisions per session or 12 decisions per session. It's more the nature of what kind of magnitude. Having 5 small magnitude decisions versus 2 big magnitude decisions, that's very different, and they can both feel satisfying. But can that hold up over 30 minutes, over 45 minutes, over 2 hours? There are some fantastic 15-minute games that if they lasted any longer than 15 minutes, I'd hate, right? And then there are other games that are 3 or 4 hours long that I am fine with because my decisions feel rich, and every time it's my turn, I really feel invested in it. So again, no magic formula, but I would ask the playtesters, and I would ask other people engaging with this is, when did we reach the point where this was no longer fun? And is it because you lost interest in the decisions that you were making? Is it because you felt that you no longer had an opportunity to advance your goal or get closer to victory? Or did it just feel the same? I'm working on a push your luck dice game right now. And it's fun for about 10 minutes, but it's been playing at about 45. And that's a big problem to me because I love the mechanic, but it doesn't support the rest of the structure that I have, right? So I've really got to decide, do I want this game to be a quick, snappy game where we're making decisions quickly and wrap it up soon? Or do I want to make it a longer, deeper, more in-depth game where we're carefully considering every one? Because you can't have both, right? So sometimes that decisions per session or sometimes how long should that game be is going to be a matter of what is more important to you as the designer that they take away from that experience. What are they going to talk about with their friends, right? When somebody asks about the game that they just played, how are they going to share that experience with them, right? But, you know, I'd start with maybe 3, go up from there, down from there. But it really does depend, and that kind of seems like a knee-jerk reaction answer, but it is. But I think that you can look at the player's engagement during a game session when they stop leaning forward, when they stop paying attention to other people's turns, when they start getting their phones out and checking their email, right? Then maybe the decisions per session has kind of reached its max. Yeah.
You talked about how like value is associated with time and probability in games like dice or drawing cards kind of diminishes the value or the meaning of your decisions.
Yep.
So do you think that there's sort of this curve about where probability should sit in terms of like time perspective, or because I know it varies from game to game?
So how do I feel about probability and the impact that luck and a randomizer like dice would have on the satisfaction that game players have? That's a great question because I love dice. A lot of my games have had custom dice in it. I tend to feel that people's threshold for their fortune being tied to dice is tied directly to how long that game is. We are more tolerant of chaos. We are more tolerant of things going out of our control the shorter the game is. I am a big proponent of dice and randomness, but I love luck mitigation. Here, you can roll this dice, but you have this resource that lets you re-roll a die. But you can only do it a few times per turn. What an interesting choice. I can re-roll a die. Do I spend it on the very first die roll that I fail? Do I look for a situation where that's going to be more significant? Did I wait too long and miss the opportunity to use it? So I think being able to give people options and abilities to override luck, maybe add to a die roll, re-roll dice, or somehow have some control over it is great. And that makes suddenly the dice much more interesting and compelling. They're not just at the whim of the dice. If they failed with the dice roll, but they had a resource where they could have manipulated it, that's on them. Right? So I think there are ways to mitigate the feeling that luck has on the outcome of a game if you give people resources to adjust, re-roll, or influence that luck along the way. Yeah.
I guess kind of going off of that one a little bit. So I know a few of the games you mentioned that you worked on kind of have those custom dice, the fantasy flight thing in general.
Yeah.
How do you feel that some of like the custom dice versus like numbered dice that might impact certain players' decision making? Because even though they obviously could sit and pair it, well, this is on 3 faces.
Yeah.
A lot of players don't actually do that like they would with just straight numbered dice.
So I prefer hiding the math behind colors and symbols rather than numerals. I've played with a number of people who will sit out and work out the probability of a particular action. I prefer leaving it as I've got a pretty good chance, not so much, I'm willing to take the risk, and having it be more that instinctual evaluation, right? I'm looking at a shape, a color, or something like that, and I know that there are more good sides than bad sides, but maybe not the magnitude. I far prefer the estimation and the evaluation to a calculation, partially because I'm not good at the calculation. I trust my gut, I don't trust my head, right? But I think that being able to rely on those helps, and I think that levels the playing field a little bit more, but you'll still have people who really, really want to analyze it and break it down. But I think using symbols, custom dice, and things like that make it a little bit harder. So there is a large group of people who won't go that extra step, and they'll fall into the groove a little bit with the instinct and playing it that way. At least that's my hope.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's all the time we have, but I really appreciate everybody coming here and listening to me speak. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the weekend.